and the cheat sheet documents, the links, the recordings, etc., will all be provided after the meeting. I generally email those directly to people once the meeting's finished anyway, but most things and find their way onto the Educator Hub, which you'll find in the link share down here at the bottom. Thank you to everyone who have put their details into the participant pod there. I'll leave that up for one more minute. Um, on the right hand side, during this meeting, I've got the I guess the cheat sheet document, which I also use as a bit of a run sheet for myself to go through. But I want to point out a few things before we get into the session. One of them is when you're demonstrating functionalities and how to use different pieces of Adobe Connect, it's often a requirement that we switch the views around so that people can see what the host sees. It's not much good to you if you all just see it as a participant, because you don't want to know what it's like to be a participant in that environment specifically. You're probably more interested to begin with at knowing how to do it yourself. So I will be either at times sharing my screen in the screen share here, which I've got another room where you'll be able to see what I'm doing as the host, and at other times when there are tools that we can use together, um, I'll be running them in our room in here together. So if that hasn't confused you, then I'm not trying hard enough. But basically what I'm saying is we'll be swapping and changing the views to make sure you can see what you need to see. So hopefully that makes sense. The other point is that often with these sessions, particularly with Adobe Connect, people have come because they've got a specific area or item that they want to know more about, and that's perfectly fine. If you want to pull me up at some point and ask about a particular tangent that we're talking about, put it in the chat pod and I'll get to it. If I can't get to it in the session itself, I'll do so directly with you afterwards. But yeah, we'll keep going. So does that sound okay to everyone? Um, you can put your response in the chat pod if appropriate, or use the status button at the top of the screen. Brilliant. Thank you, everybody. All right, I will close the participant pod. I'll bring it back up right at the end if people have missed it for whatever reason, but I'll hide that for now. Okay, so the intention in the session is that we're following up from the skills that we started looking at in the basic skills set. And to begin with, we start looking at some of the response tools in Adobe Connect, specifically the question and answer pod. So what I'm going to do at this point is I'm going to share my screen and open up a separate room so we can start from scratch with a Q&A pod at what it looks like for the host. Okay, so we'll share my screen. I'm going to jump into my other room. So here we have basically a blank layout, but I've got some attendees in here. We've got some other people in here with different roles, and the purpose for that will become apparent in just a moment. I can still see your chat pod input if you've got anything to add in there. So I'm going to go up to pods, go to Q&A and turn that on. And I think what I'm going to do is clear all these questions using the menu at the top, and we'll start from scratch. So I've got a Q&A pod, and the first thing that you notice is there's a couple of icons at the top here. If you hover the mouse, one tells you that it's the presenter view, what I can see, and the other one, what participants can see. Now I do have some participants in this room. One of them is cleverly called LK Phone, and I'm going to actually ask a question using the pod. So what does that look like for a participant? All they get basically is a text field and maybe somewhere up here where they can see what they've typed in. So the person on the phone says, how do I, and then whatever. That question goes into the room. Should go into the room. There we go. It doesn't appear to be showing up. Hang on, host. There we go. Okay. So, the phone's asked this question. Now at the moment, everyone else in the room, apart from the host, can't see this question. So it's just between the participant and the host. At that point, the host gets to decide, clicking on it, they can put in their response or their reply to that question. All you do is blah blah, and then you have to make a decision about whether or not you want to send the answers to that to them directly, or do you want to send it so that it's visible to everyone. Obviously that depends on the type of question that goes in there and what you're wanting to use the Q&A for, but at this stage I'm going to say send to everyone. And if I switch our view back again to what the participants can see, we've got the person's question and my response. So specifically the Q&A pod gets more used in sessions where there are a lot of people. So yesterday, for example, in our session we had someone with 500 students in each of their meetings. When they were running orientations and inductions and things like that, sometimes it started to get pretty big, and they wanted to really have a way of collating the questions coming in to be able to revisit them later or make sure they're not missing anything. So the Q&A pod provides an effective way of doing that. Instead of trying to keep track of, you can imagine what 500 people in a chat pod looks like. It starts to get pretty wild. So the instruction there is, if you've got specific questions for me, put them into the Q&A pod. I'll respond to it if I can during the session, or after the session I'll get back to everyone. If we go and have a look at the menu options in here, you've also got the option of being able to export all the questions and email them to yourself. So that means that if they've all gone in there, at the end of the session you can send it to yourself and you've just got the list of questions that can be responded to. Maybe you want to respond on the discussion board, via your landing page, through an email, whatever the case may be. But you do have the ability to collect all that information and preserve it. So that's handy. The other way to distinguish Q&A from the chat pod, for example, is you can, if you've got a co-pilot, for example, or someone that is helping run the session, you can sort of appoint who's doing what or who needs to answer things. So this may not be something that applies to you, but quite often if we get specialists in a meeting that can respond to certain types of questions, you might find someone moderating and allocating questions to particular hosts. So for example, if we ask our question again, how do whatever, in goes that question. Have a look at our host view. So I've got a new question coming in, how do I, and I go, right, well actually I can't answer that, but this person over here, this other presenter, who's not Lachlan, can answer that question. So in that case, I then can go up here to assign to and choose this person. You'll see there's a little lock that's appeared next to it, and only this presenter is going to be able to respond to that question. And the same deal, when they put in their response, they'll be choosing whether or not it's going privately or not. You can undo and assign, either to none or to send it to someone else, but that might have some use for you. Okay, so that's about all we need to know about the Q&A at this point. If you've got any questions about it, put it in the chat pod and I'll get to it. Otherwise, I'll move along. Polls, next tool. So this is probably one of the more popular features of Adobe Connect compared to other remote delivery tools. It's relatively easy to use. I'm sure a lot of you have used polls before, but basically you go up to pods, down to poll, add a new poll, and you've got the option to choose between 3 question types: multiple choice, multiple answer, which is the same as multiple choice essentially, but you can choose more than one, or a short answer, which is more your open response type question. So we'll go through the process of making some of those. Multiple choice, so for example, what does that equal? It tells you to separate your answers line by line. So does it equal 2, 4, 3, 4, whatever? And then I need to open my poll. It looks like this. For the participants, they can click on responses and then it presents those results visually. So in terms of how many people in the room have answered the question, as both graph and percentage. You can choose whether or not you want those results broadcast so everyone can see them. I usually have that on unless it's something of a private nature, but that's the multiple choice version in a nutshell. You can vote yourself. You'll see there I've clicked on it. 100% of the people that have attempted it, which is one, have responded with a question. So if I wanted to stop or change the format of this poll, I can go up to edit and change the question type. So this time we might make it multiple answers. Open the poll again, and that means people are allowed to have a couple of cracks at things. So I could say, well, I think it equals that and that. So obviously this type of question is not really going to work, but if you were asking for someone to identify from a list maybe things that are appropriate to them, choices that they've made, and you want them to be able to identify more than one option, that's the question type, multiple answers. So it's possibly one of the most commonly used. Let's change this again. I'm going to change the question type to short answer. This time we'll have a question that is a bit open. Tell me about X, how do you feel about Y, etc. And we open that. And now for the participants it looks like this. They can see the question. This is where they put their answer in. And that answer comes in, and because I've got broadcast results checked, it's visible to everyone. Again, if you don't want it visible, uncheck the broadcast results and only the host can see those responses to the poll. Let's have a look at what other options we've got going on inside this pod. If, for example, you notice here that it doesn't tell you who's answered what, and you're never able to provide that information to the other participants in the room through this tool directly, it's anonymous. However, as the host, you can click on this button that says View Votes, and that tells me that this attendee put in this response. Okay, so you can see who's answered what, but the participants can't see that information unless you've somehow shared your screen and you want them to see that. By default, it's not visible. So I get a list of my responses. I can go in and see who's answered what. What else can I do? That's just like hitting the enter key. That submits a response. If you changed your answer, put in a new one and submit it again, you'll see that it replaces your original one. So the short answer does not allow you to post multiple responses. You get one crack allocated to your login, for example, but you can change it. If we look at the pod options up in the top right hand corner, well, we can clear the responses if we want to reuse this poll. We can create a new one. We can select other polls that are running at the same time and get them to overwrite this one. Probably not what you're after. What I was really looking for, I think, when I first found out about this tool was a way to export the information that comes in here. Unfortunately, that doesn't exist. So basically, if I wanted these broadcast or shared, what I would need to do is basically either use the snipping tool, for example, in Windows and take a snapshot of those answers, or you could try and highlight them and copy paste that way, but still it's not quite the same. Even if we look at viewing the votes, it doesn't really give us a simple way of exporting that information from the poll. So in terms of preserving it, I'd be getting used to using the snip tool in Windows or the equivalent in Mac. So that's polls in a nutshell. They get used a lot. You can certainly run more than one at once, and people usually leave them open in rooms either at the start, the same way that you filled out your participant information. That's essentially just a poll, but it's a short answer, so open response. But we can add in multiple polls. You can leave them up, you can hide them. You can certainly bring them back later. If you've clicked on hide, they don't get deleted, for example. So there was one that was made somewhere before about teacher presence. And I can bring that back along with the responses that were there from before into the room as well. If you want to clear those responses, you would need to select that from the menu, clear all answers. and there we're reset back to 0. So you can make polls in advance, keep them, hide them, and then bring them back into your meeting rooms later on. However, it's only attached to your meeting room, so you're not going to be able to import it into someone else's. Kristen, it's a good question. It's not the same as a screenshot. It does, I guess, a similar thing, but if you just type in snip into your search, click on your start button and search and type the word snip in. If you're on Windows, you'll see that there's a snipping tool, or there should be, and it allows you to select the area and take a shot of a defined space rather than the whole screen. Okay, so that's polls. Moving that out of the way, we'll keep going. Right, breakout rooms. Okay, so this is going to be a slightly tricky exercise because you really need to see what a host sees for breakouts in terms of managing them. However, I want you to experience that environment as a participant. So we're going to do a bit of chopping and changing. Firstly, I'm going to show you what it looks like as a host and where we access things. A lot of people want to know about breakouts and how to use them. My first point that I'll make on them is that they take a lot of planning to use effectively until you get really comfortable with the tool set. So let's start with where they begin, and it starts with the attendee pod and the second button. If you hover over it, it says breakout room view. If you click on it, you'll see that it's going to give you a number of breakout rooms. I think 3 is the default that it starts with, but you can always add more breakout rooms by clicking on this plus sign. What happens when you start breakouts, clicking start breakouts, it's going to create that number of rooms based on the layout that you launch it from. So that becomes important for planning. So if you're in your normal room that's got all of your pods laid out, your share pods, all those other pieces of information, and you click start breakouts, it's going to duplicate those layouts for all the breakout rooms. Maybe that's not what you want. So for a breakout activity, you might have very specific activities or pods in mind that you want the participants to use. So you probably want to organize those into some type of breakout foyer, for example, before you click on start breakouts. I'll get into that in just a second. I've got a layout in here that I've made beforehand that I call breakout foyer, and it's got a few areas that I generally use if I'm running a breakout activity. Maybe I want videos to be available, so there's a webcam pod that's in there. Maybe I want a notes space to be available for people to type in together, so I've got a notes pod. I've got another notes pod here which is instructions for the activity. I'm a little bit retentive on these things, so I generally provide information in this environment, but it's advisable if you want them to achieve certain things within the time. If I want links to be available to the breakout groups, then I've got a links pod in there. I've got a files pod. I've also got a share pod in case they want to be able to share documents or screens, etc. inside every one of those breakout rooms. So this is a layout that I've created in advance. When I click on start breakouts, I can see that there are 3 people that this is going to affect, by the way. There are my participants. And when I hover my mouse over the top of them, you'll see that it provides possibilities for which breakout room they can be allocated to. So you can do that manually in advance. So I might say, I want this guy on the phone, LK phone, to be in breakout room 1. I click that and his name appears underneath there. But I haven't clicked start breakouts yet, so it's only going to take effect once I launch them. So it's kind of a way of organizing them. If I wanted to take him out of it and bring him back into that pool, the main meeting, I can select that. So you can manually allocate people to breakouts if you want to, or there's this lovely button up here which says evenly distribute from main. So that will take everyone in the list and automatically divide them up equally into different breakout rooms. I'm going to do that with us as a group in just a moment, back in our shared meeting room. But just to show you what this looks like again as a host, I'm going to start breakouts after I distribute everyone. you'll see that it hasn't affected the host. I'm still in this main meeting area. These guys, once I start breakouts, will be in group 1 and group 2. And I'll click start breakouts now. I get a notification up the top that it's started, and there's this yellow icon with crosshairs showing that breakouts are going on. And I've got an option to send a message to everyone, broadcast to everyone in breakout spaces, or I can end the breakouts altogether up there. And if that disappears, or if I click OK, I can bring it back up by left clicking on that icon. Okay, so I'm still in the main meeting area, and if I'm talking as the host, these guys are in their rooms now, they can't hear me. Okay, so I'd need to be in the same room as them. So it's basically launching a separate meeting room space where they can only hear what's going on inside their own breakout room. So I want to go and have a look now on what's happening in group 1. So I'm going to allocate myself into breakout room 1. You'll see that my layout reorients. And because Lachlan previously has played around with these breakout spaces, you'll see the layout's been changed manually. So that whole point I made about making a breakout layout that's uniform for everyone, I've obviously gone in the past and changed these layouts. Well done me. So I can now see, they can hear me talking because I'm in the same room as breakout room 1, but I can, I guess, touch base, make sure they're doing the right things, provide some feedback, and then move right along. Put myself into breakout room 2, hover my mouse over my name, and go hop into breakout room 2, Lachlan. Are they doing what they're supposed to be doing? Great. Now I'm going to send a message to everyone. 2 minutes. Out it goes. Maybe part of the activity was that after they've got together their bits of information, we're all going to get back together in the main group and share that information. Just to demonstrate a particular point, I'm in breakout room 2. This is called, this pod that's in this room is called breakout 2 notes, 51 in this case. Stuff from breakout 2. Let's say that they took some notes together and they want to be able to share those back as a group later on. When I end the breakouts, again, I know that it's ended because that icon's not up here up top anymore, and this says start breakouts, so we're not started. So I've got everyone back together in my breakout area and saying, right, I'd like group 2 to now present their findings, for example. If I go up to pods, I can go down to this option that's now visible, breakout pods. I can see breakout room 2, and I can find the notes that I'm looking for and bring that into the main group. So whatever work that they've collaboratively put together, for example, if they want to present on it to the rest of the group, you can import that back into your other meeting rooms. Okay, it's preserved like that, so that's pretty nifty for a group activity. So you can see there's a whole lot of thinking and planning and organizing for these tasks if you want it to sort of stick to time and to achieve particular outcomes, etc., etc. It probably helps to be fairly prescriptive, that you've got some instructions telling them what you're hoping for them to achieve in that time, and that you've got the facility when they do get back together to bring in the objects that they've built. So breakouts are great. I love them. They do take some getting used to. I'm going to stop sharing for a second and run a breakout session so you all get see what it's like from the participant end. So I'm back in the room with you guys, and this is the layout that I've currently got in this room. If I click on the breakouts view and click on evenly distribute my participants, you can't see this at the moment, but I'm about to do it, and I've started the breakouts. Hello, breakout room 1. I'm now in this same space with you, and you'll notice if you're looking at your attendees pods that all of you have been elevated to presenters because your mics are now available if you want to use them. So this happens in breakout rooms. You're suddenly elevated so that you can use all of the pods in the room. I can see Kylie typing in there. You can see that all of the pods are empty. So what you've got now is that whilst it took the layout option that I wanted, it clears all the pods. So Kylie, what you'll see is that your mic is available if you click on the microphone icon up the top. It probably wasn't visible before. Yep, so you could just click on from white to green and you can do talking in your breakout group. I'm going to jump into breakout room 2 and explain the same sorts of things to them. So enjoy this for a minute. Feel free to chat to each other, etc. But I'm jumping into the next room. Hello, breakout room 2. It is a little weird, Carol. I absolutely agree. I'm basically demonstrating at this point, all of you, once breakouts start, are elevated to presenters. So what that means is that your mics are now available. If you wanted to click on your microphone icons up the top, you can use your mics to talk to each other. But you'll notice that each of the pods that have been duplicated, my breakout layout, are cleared of content. And that's a feature of when you start breakouts. You get all the pods you wanted, but there's nothing in them. So I'll comment on that when we get back together in just a second. But if you wanted to switch your mics on and see that working, etc., chat to each other, turn on your webcams, you can certainly do all those things. I'm just going to talk to group 3 for a second. Hello, breakout room 3, lucky last. Penny, that's a brilliant point. It's absolutely true. So you couldn't hear me because I was in the main room and then I went into breakout group 1, breakout group 2, and now I'm with you guys. So the main point to make here is that when you launch breakouts, all of the participants get elevated to presenters, so they can use any of the pods. If you wanted to click up into the notes pods, by all means, you can type into them now. If you wanted to turn your microphones on, you'll see that the icon for your mics is now available. So you can certainly do some talking to each other, etc. if you needed to. If you wanted to turn on your webcam with your videos, etc., that feature's available to you as well. So it gives you access to all the pods in the room, but you'll notice that aspect of all the pods being cleared of content has implications for preparation. So I'm going to end the breakouts in just a second so we get back to each other. So a question from Kristen, do I find that students don't use their microphones and prefer to type? Yes, but it also depends on the cohort. If you're dealing with more mature age students in some cases and particular disciplines, for example, they like to use their mics and do talking. So in other cases with the younger students, the chat pod is king. Okay, I'm going to end breakouts for just a second and we'll get back together and chat. Okay, we're all back together now in the main area. I've ended the breakouts. I'm going to throw us back into our presentation room. Actually, I'll just change the view so I can see you all. So, if you'd like to put in the chat pod, or I can turn people's mics on for a minute, what your experience was when we launched breakouts just then, I'm more than interested to hear about it. Mic rights have been turned on. If you wanted to have a chat, by all means put your hand up and go for it. Kristen, I can see you typing. Yeah, absolutely. Kristen, that's a brilliant point, which is why I usually have instructions for the activity in one of those note pods. Even if I've explained it to them as a group before I launch it, I almost always have a notes pod with instructions for the task in the breakout rooms themselves. And that's really important because if I only want them to spend 10 minutes together or something and to achieve certain things, you've got to be quite prescriptive, even to the point where sort of saying type stuff in here, appoint a speaker, for example, to provide the feedback from the group. Make sure that you've included, X, Y, Z, whatever the case may be. It does require planning, direction, I do know some people that use the breakouts tool quite sort of free form and they're not too stressed about what they get out of it. More the dynamic is important. That's fine, but if you've got time restraints and you want particular outcomes, then direction is absolutely needed. If we scroll down in the notes, for example, um, or you've downloaded them from the file share, you'll see that under some of the tips. Pre-prepared content really is king when it comes to the breakouts. Another feature of the breakout rooms when you use them is that you can import other content. This is assuming that you're setting them up before you get your students in there. You can import other pods, other share pods, other documents into the breakout room. So you don't have to create everything from scratch. If you've got one that's pre-prepared, you can add those pods or that content into the rooms. Otherwise, you're going to end up doing a fair bit of copying and pasting. Okay, so look, you can spend a lot of time trying to talk about breakouts, but the best way to get your head around it is to have a play with your own rooms and give it a go, because no one gets it the first time. It takes a bit of practice, and just be prepared to get that sort of feedback from students. What do I do? What should we be doing in here? If you jump into those rooms yourself, they'll be asking exactly the same questions that you were. Okay, I'll turn the mics off at that point and keep going. Breakouts, breakouts, breakouts. Okay, so let's talk about the presenter only area. I'm going to share my screen again so you can see what this looks like. Just out of curiosity, if you want to put in the chat pod, who has used the presenter only area before? Anyone? Okay, looks like some of you have. That's great. Okay, so the presenter only area. I'm looking at a layout. I mean, we were using this for our breakouts a minute ago. Let's go back to something a little clearer. So in this room, I happen to have an attendees pod of the Q&A pod I added before, and a poll. If I go up to meeting at the top left here and go down to enable presenter only area, click on that. It opens up this space on the right hand side, which is like a closet, I guess. It allows you to have new content ready to bring into the room. Your participants cannot see what's going on in this space. They can't see the objects that are in there. If you've got something in there, all you do is left click and drag it into the room, and then they can see it. So this is a case of assuming that you've got content that you want to deal with at different times throughout your presentation and you want to bring it in, then you can load it in here in advance and just drag it into the room and use it. Similarly, if you've got something that you're not using at the moment, I don't need this poll right now, I can drag it into the presenter only area and it disappears. That space can be manipulated, made bigger or smaller for you if that makes things easier, using that little toggle. But yes, it's a private space for you to have content ready to go to bring into your meetings. Yes, you could load the content on the fly in the meetings, but that also tends to slow down things for participants. Literally, it has an impact on bandwidth because you're uploading files and data into the room. So I would advise that if you've got multiple documents or files or things you want to use in your meeting that you don't necessarily want to use right at the beginning, you've got some choices, but one of them is loading that content into this area. If the presenter only area is on and you go to add a new pod, let's say I want a new share pod for example, you'll see that it loads automatically in this space, not into the room. So then I can load my document in there, share document. I will find some very important document that I want to use. Here's a PDF. It loads into the room ready for me to drag in when I need to use it. Some people like to use this space to have sort of an agenda or a check sheet for themselves, things to run through that they don't want necessarily visible for the students. You can absolutely do that as well. So I'm going to hide that. I'm going to get rid of that poll and that one as well. And I'm going to say one other thing about the presenter only area. and that is that you can turn it on and use it in your breakout rooms as well. So you can have one there. But keep in mind that once you put all your participants into breakout rooms, they become presenters. So they'll be able to access the presenter only area as well. They'll be able to see it. So that might be useful to you if you've got things that need to be brought in, or maybe not. So just consider under the meeting option if you want to enable the presenter only area or disable the presenter only area. That's important. So a feature of the presenter only area that's available to everyone now in your meeting rooms is this lovely tool called the Engagement Dashboard tool. So I'll talk a little bit about that. To some people it's a bit gimmicky, and I'm inclined to agree sometimes, but it does provide interesting, useful information. So I'll have a bit of a glance at that. What this meter does is it takes a snapshot every minute of the activity of every participant in the room. So if they're moving their mouse around, if they're typing into the chat pod, if the meeting room screen is actually the first screen that they're looking at and hasn't been minimized and they're chatting on Facebook, etc. whilst you're talking, all of those things have an impact on the engagement calculation. It doesn't take much to measure as 100%, but let's say if you're watching what's going on in the meeting and using some of the pods in the room, typing in the chat pod, etc., it's going to measure as 100. So it does that for every participant in the room every minute, and it provides that information as a percentage, and it also gives an average for what's going on. If we look down here on the left hand side where my attendees bar is, you'll see these colors that are next to people's names. You can only see those as a presenter or a host. These are reflections of the engagement meter for each individual. So this person, not Lachlan, I can see is completely unengaged according to that meter because he's red. So that tells me that he's probably looking at something else and not necessarily engaging with what's going on in the meeting room. So there's a little bit of Big Brother going on, but it also tells you how long the session's been running for. It provides a summary of any of the interactive activities that have been added to the room. So if you've got a Q&A pod in the room, it'll give me a summary of how many people have put responses in there. In this case, there were 2 questions that were put into the Q&A pod and only one of them has been responded to. That's what this representation shows me. I had a poll that was an open response, and I can see that out of the 3 participants in the room, 1, 2, 3, only one of them has attempted that task. So it's giving me a snapshot or a summary of who's attempted the activities, all in the one place. So that's kind of handy as well. You can also reset the session time. The engagement timer. Usually this starts when you start the session, by the way, but you can always reset it. You'll see at the moment there's no color because it hasn't been running for a minute yet. The options for it really at this stage are only to hide or to reset the timer. So you've got the engagement dashboard tool, you've got the individual engagement meter, which is the attendees pod version of the engagement dashboard. And if you go to the menu in your attendees pod as a host or as a presenter, you can see the option down here, show individual engagement. At the moment it's ticked, that's why I can see those colors. If it's not ticked, you can't see them. So that's the engagement meter and the individual engagement meter. Sorry, the engagement dashboard, I should say. If the engagement dashboard is not visible to you in your rooms when you open the presenter only area, it's because under pods, this option, engagement dashboard, is not checked. If it's unchecked, not in there. If it's checked, there it is. So that's how we make sure that we can see the engagement dashboard. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing for a second and come back into the room. We can talk a little bit about bandwidth. We're tracking pretty well time-wise. Does anyone have any pressing urgent questions at this point in time? Okay, Kylie says, does the engagement pod keep track of the number of attendees at the peak of the session? Not in a report type function, I guess. It's not looking at capturing that information so that you can see the whole continuum of the session, what it looked like in the first 5 minutes, 10 minutes. So yeah, it's showing how many attendees are in the room at that point in time that you're looking at it, definitely. But it's taking account of the ones that are in the session at that point in time. Okay. Some of the reports that you can run in the back end of Adobe Connect do allow you to get a spread of what people were doing at different times, but that's definitely a different presentation. The reporting in Adobe Connect is a pretty cumbersome to use, and I'm sure there are people in this meeting that can attest to that. Okay, so bandwidth. I'll just scroll this down a little bit so we can all get on the same page. Bandwidth considerations. So I'm not sure to what extent people have had bad or positive experiences with Adobe Connect. It's usually a feature of feedback that I get from academics, is that they're trying to do different things and students have either dropped out or it starts stuttering, or in older versions of Adobe Connect the video recordings or the live recording even were stuttery, creating problems. In a lot of instances it's related to bandwidth. We can't really guarantee what students' connections look like, so that means that we have sort of bandwidth mitigation strategies when running meetings. One such strategy, for example, is loading a picture of yourself into the room, like I have in the corner, into a SharePod rather than using the webcam. If I have a webcam pod added to the room, which I certainly can do, have that sitting there. The moment I hit start webcam, it has an impact on the bandwidth for everyone. I'm going to show you, you can click yourself on the bandwidth meter, which is in the top right hand corner of the room, the little green meter. If you left click on that, it'll give you a breakdown of how much bandwidth uploading, downloading is going on. And because I've got my webcam on, for me it's saying almost, well, it is 100 kilobits per second as I'm talking, but down is still very low. For you guys, I'm assuming that it's saying your download speed is a lot higher. The kilobit usage is higher, and the uploads are not as much. So everything that you use that impacts on that live stream, whether it's your webcam, uploading content we talked about before, using the screen share, all those things impact on the bandwidth. And unless you're sure that everyone's connection is strong, or they're in a connection provided by institution, for example, then there's potential for a problem, is what I'm saying. I'm not saying there will be one, but the potential is there. If you're using the webcam and you decide to start by saying, your introductions or hi to people, and then you want to leave your picture up, you can pause the picture and it freezes it, and it doesn't have an impact on bandwidth. So I can see my upload speed is now dropping drastically as I stop using the webcam. Okay, so can presenters and participants see the green bandwidth bars? You can see your own. So it tells you about your own connection. Can you see it at the moment in the top right hand corner? Okay, great. Thanks, Hetty. Yep, so it's an individual count, but it's impacted by everyone in the meeting. So as an example, if I turned everyone's mic on in the room and you you click the green button on your microphones to turn them on, that would add significantly to the bandwidth being used for the room. So audio for the mic, more bandwidth. Webcams, multiple video streams, extra bandwidth. Sharing your screen, extra bandwidth. Those are the main things that impact on bandwidth. So it's something to be conscious of when you have students using the mobile app, for example, to connect to the meetings, and in some cases they're talking about using Macca's Wi-Fi, things like that. So there are, I suppose, simple mitigation strategies if you're worried about bandwidth. We also have a lot of academics that are presenting from home, etc., and in locations where maybe their internet is not stellar, and that also is something to consider to make that a more practical experience for everyone. Okay, moving on briefly, I'm going to talk about the Adobe extensions and some of their applications just very briefly. There's a website. The link to the website is in the link share pod, but I'll send it out later as well. Where if you want to add in additional functionalities to your rooms, have a look at what's possible. It's on the Adobe Connect applications or extensions website. I can share my screen for a moment and show you what that looks like, no problem. I'm not going to get into any of them particularly except for one perhaps. Adobe Connect apps and extensions. Each of these options, I'm not talking about the pricing at this stage, but each of the options allows you to download a file which you can load into your rooms through the SharePod. So let's assume that you wanted to grab it, that you were able to get it. You would download the file, then you could open a new SharePod in your meeting room and upload that particular app into the room and use it. The complication is that a lot of these meeting pods, particularly if they're any good, cost money. And if you want them to be available as part of the tool set, such as the YouTube pod, for example, we get a lot of requests about that one, then a decision is sort of made by management at the university dealing with DIT, DLT, etc. About whether or not they want to front the bill for an institutional license for the pod. I think probably some people in the room can attest to just how difficult it is to get that through. Keep asking is what I'm saying. Thank you, Yappa. Yep. So one of the pods in here, I'd say have a look at each of these and see if they've got some potential for you. Some of them are free. The countdown timer I've used before to make sure I keep to time. The digital timer for sessions I've used before. The one I'm going to talk about today is actually the doorbell, which is down here, Doorbell Connect. If I go into my other meeting room, I'll show you what this looks like and why it's useful. I'll hide this and hide this. I'm going to add a new SharePod. In my room, I'll get rid of the presenter only area. That's not helping things. Disable. In my SharePod, I'm going to choose Share Document and I'm going to upload this pod that I had, which is called Doorbell. It's an SWF file if that helps people, but I've downloaded it to my computer. Now I'm bringing it into the room and it looks like this. What happens with the doorbell, and I'll load it into our room, is that anyone that enters the meeting room, because this box play on entry is checked, anyone that comes into the room, it'll ring, ding dong. You probably didn't hear that, so I'll add it into our room, but the point of the doorbell is I don't have to stay in my Adobe Connect meeting room to know when someone has joined. So if, for example, you wanted to run drop-in sessions for your students or your some sort of consultation time, but you didn't want to sit in the room waiting for them to turn up to see that their name's in the attendee pod, etc., then you can use the doorbell function so that you know when someone's joined the room. So it's I've mostly seen it used for consultation for drop-ins. So if I stop sharing and let's stop sharing, Lachlan. I'll add that doorbell tool into this room so you can all click on it together. I'm sure it will be a great experience. Let's have a look. SharePod, share document, find the doorbell, add it into the room. Ding dong, thank you, Jeff. Brilliant. Okay, so that's how the doorbell pod works. It can sit in a tile. You can minimize the size of it, sit it in the corner. Hopefully they'll see it. That's why I usually make it big enough to make sure that they know that's what they need to do. And when someone joins the room or it rings, or they can click on it again and it'll get your attention. If you wanted to get even more prescriptive about it, you could have a notes pod with big letters saying, ring the doorbell when you turn up and I'll come into the room. Just means that you can multitask and do other things whilst you're waiting for someone to show up. That's just one application that's in the Adobe Connect Extensions website, but allows a little bit more versatility. The very last feature before I end today's session that I'm going to talk about is the auto promote feature. As a host, I'm going to share my screen again so you can see the other room. Oh, one sec. Share, share, share. Okay, this is turned on by hosts underneath. Good question, Lachlan. Where did I find it before? Okay, underneath the meeting option. The second option down, manage access and entry to your rooms. If I go down here to the last option, it says auto promote participants to presenters. So this is, once I've clicked on that, I get this information icon glowing, which says that participants, when they join the room, are automatically made presenters. The reason that this is important is if you want rooms for students to be able to use without a host being there, this feature needs to be turned on. Otherwise, they'll be able to join the room and get kicked out again shortly afterwards. I think there's 10 to 15 minute timer on the rooms. But if you want them to be able to use the space without you being in there necessarily, or to create separate meeting spaces for students to use for different tasks or study groups or for an assessment or for whatever purpose, you can create student-only rooms just by turning on the auto promote feature. Because they're presenters, they'll be able to join the meeting and use that space without you needing to be there necessarily. So it's being used more and more, but mostly associated with, for example, either study group use or for an assessment task. If you've got groups for that task that need to get together, you can have space for the students to use that doesn't necessarily involve using your own meeting room or you being there. So that's the auto promote feature that I just wanted to talk about. I realise I've gone a bit over time this morning. Thank you for your patience, and if you have any questions, etc., I'm going to hang around for the next 10 or so. But thank you again, and we'll see you at the next session. Thanks, everybody.